The millionaire's wheelchair-bound son hadn't smiled since the accident until the new nanny convinced him to pose for a photo. But when the millionaire arrives and sees the scene, he does something no one expected and leaves her speechless. The iron gate swung open slowly, a sleeping giant stretching itself awake with a low metallic groan. The sound was the only noise Richard allowed on his homecoming, a sonic border between the world outside, where he commanded a Wall Street empire of numbers and decisions, and the dense silence that awaited him within. The pale stone courtyard, impeccably clean, reflected the pale light of late afternoon, a cold, static stage where nothing seemed to breathe. He parked the luxury sedan, its engine a potent whisper that would soon fall silent, and before he could turn the key, something stopped him. A light, almost unreal sound of laughter, a sound that hadn't echoed between these walls for 3 long, barren years. Richard's brow furrowed, the crease between his eyebrows deepening like a fissure in rock. He cut the engine and stepped out, his body tense beneath the perfectly tailored suit. Each step toward the source of those voices a break in his routine of calculated silences. And that's when he saw it. His son, Leo, in his wheelchair, had his face turned to the sky, and he was smiling. Not a twitch, not a vague reflex, but a genuine smile that lifted the corners of his mouth and lit up the eyes Richard had grown used to seeing clouded over. Before him, kneeling on the cold stones, was the new caregiver, a young woman of simple appearance, holding a vintage camera. "Just one more, Leo," she was saying, her voice soft as velvet. "Look at the sun, like you're telling it a secret." The scene froze him. The air seemed to change temperature, suddenly becoming thin. This wasn't just a picture, it was a miracle. But miracles, he had learned the hard way, always come at a high price. The thought was a reflex, a defense mechanism forged in years of loss and disappointment. His vast fortune, a portfolio built with the cold precision of a man who understood stocks and the crypto market, couldn't buy his wife's happiness or stop her from leaving. His money, spread across assets and investments around the globe, couldn't prevent the accident that had stolen his son's mobility. Richard was a man who mastered the cash flow of conglomerates, who understood interest rates and dividends like few others, but he had become illiterate in the matters of the soul. He watched the woman, Elena, whose name he barely remembered reading on the contract. She didn't look at him, completely absorbed in the boy. Her focus was absolute, her dedication visible in the way her body curved to shield the camera lens from the direct light, creating the perfect shadow for Leo's face. There was an intimacy to the scene, a bubble of warmth and complicity that excluded him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like an outsider in his own home. The click of the camera sounded sharp in the silence that returned, and Leo's smile transformed into an open laugh, a pure sound that ricocheted off the mansion's walls. Richard's heart gave a painful leap, a mix of overwhelming joy and a deep, irrational fear. This woman, in a matter of days, had achieved what doctors, therapists, and all his capital had not in years. She had found a crack in Leo's darkness and was flooding it with light, and that terrified him. His jaw tight, he stepped forward, the shadow of his body casting over them like a dark cloud. Leo's laughter ceased instantly. Elena looked up, and her eyes, a shade of brown that seemed to hold stories, met his. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a defensive posture as she slowly rose to her feet, the camera still in her hands. The miracle was over, and the price was about to be collected. The silence that fell was heavier than the stones of the courtyard. Richard didn't raise his voice, didn't make a sudden move. His power lay not in outbursts, but in the glacial control he exerted over himself and everything his money could touch. His eyes, a stormy gray, fixed on Eleanor, not with anger, but with a cold assessment, as if analyzing a high-risk asset in his investment portfolio. "Take the boy inside," he said, his voice low and without inflection. His physical therapy session starts in 10 minutes. The order was a bucket of ice water on the ember of joy that had sparked moments before. Elena felt heat rise to her face, a mixture of humiliation and defiance. Swallowing the retort that formed in her throat, she nodded stiffly and turned to Leo, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come on, champ. Time to work those muscles." Her voice, though trembling, was a refuge of gentleness in the now hostile environment. She pushed the wheelchair toward a side door of the mansion, feeling her employer's gaze on her back with every foot of stone she crossed. As they passed through the doorway, the slender, impeccable figure of Mrs. Gable, the house manager, materialized in the hallway as if she'd been standing guard. Her small, sharp eyes flicked from Elena to the boy, and a crease of disapproval marked her forehead. "I'll take it from here," she said, her voice as starched as her uniform. She took control of the wheelchair with an efficiency that bordered on harshness, dismissing Elena with a nod. "Mr. Richard doesn't like disruptions to Leo's routine." It was a warning, clear and sharp. Elena stood motionless in the opulent hallway, feeling suddenly small and out of place. The cold marble under her feet seemed to suck the warmth from her body. The high walls, adorned with art that was surely worth a fortune, watched her with indifference. From his glass-walled office, Richard observed the scene. He saw the house manager leading his son away and the caregiver standing still, looking like a wildflower trying to bloom in concrete. That moment in the garden had destabilized him. Seeing Leo smile like that had been like an electric shock to his heart. But the joy was followed by a dizzying panic. Happiness was fragile, and he had learned not to trust it. He had built his wealth, his vast net worth in dollars and euros, on logic and predictability. Emotions were liabilities, not assets. This woman, with her camera and her smiles, was a variable he didn't know how to calculate. Later, after ensuring Leo was with the physical therapist, Mrs. Gable found Elena in the kitchen. "I know you're new here," she began, polishing a crystal glass with a linen cloth. "But you must understand that this house operates under very strict rules. Leo's well-being depends on a delicate balance. Any disturbance could be detrimental." The word disturbance hung in the air, laden with meaning. Elena understood. Joy was a disturbance. "I just wanted him to see the sun," she replied quietly. Mrs. Gable placed the glass down with a precise click. "The boy has everything he needs, the best care money can buy. What he doesn't need is false hope." With that, the house manager left, leaving Elena with the weight of those words. That night, from her small room, she looked out the window to the living room below. In the center of the vast space, covered by a white linen sheet, stood a grand piano. The fine dust that had settled on the fabric spoke of its abandonment. An idea, an impulse of stubbornness and hope, began to sprout in her chest. The next morning, while helping Leo with breakfast, she casually mentioned to Mrs. Gable, "I saw you have a piano. Does Leo like music?" The house manager's reaction was immediate and sharp. She stopped what she was doing and turned to Eleanor, her face a mask of severity. "That piano has not been played in 3 years, young lady, and by Mr. Richard's express order, no one, absolutely no one, is permitted to even lift that sheet." Mrs. Gable's prohibition echoed in Elena's mind all day, as cold and final as a judge's sentence. It wasn't just a rule, it was a wall built around an open wound. She watched Leo during lunch, noticing how the boy's gaze would drift toward the living room door whenever a longer silence fell between them. There was a longing there, a curiosity tinged with pain that the house manager, in her blind loyalty to the order, refused to see. Elena understood that the piano wasn't just a piece of dust-covered furniture. It was the heart of the house, and it had stopped beating. To challenge the order directly would be reckless, a battle lost before it even began. But Elena's soul, shaped by the need to find light in dark corners, was resourceful. She didn't need the piano to bring the music back. That afternoon, in Leo's room, as the boy stared without interest at a picture book, she took her phone out of her bag. Carefully, she chose a classical piano piece, a soft, melancholy melody her mother used to love. She kept the volume low, a whisper of sound that barely reached the hallway. At first, Leo didn't react, but gradually, his fingers, which rested inertly on his lap, began to move, drumming lightly against his pants, a faint but present rhythm. A fleeting glint of recognition passed through his eyes. Elena said nothing, just watched, her heart tight with hope. Across the mansion, in his glass-walled office, Richard was reviewing an investment spreadsheet, analyzing the performance of overseas funds. The logic of numbers, the clarity of profit and loss, had always been his safe harbor. But the faint sound of music infiltrated his concentration, a dissonant note in his symphony of controlled silence. Irritation was his first reaction. Another infraction from that woman. He stood up, ready to end the insubordination, to reassert the rules that kept his inner chaos in check. His steps were firm and silent on the Persian rugs. However, as he neared his son's room, something made him pause at the threshold, hidden by the shadows. He did not see an act of rebellion. He saw his son, eyes closed, head tilted slightly, moving his fingers as if playing an invisible keyboard. He saw Elena sitting on the floor beside the wheelchair, simply present, sharing the moment with a reverent quietude. The scene hit him with the force of a wave. That small gesture from Leo was a connection to a past Richard was trying to bury under layers of work and wealth. The music had been his late wife's language, and for a terrifying moment, he felt her presence there. The anger dissipated, replaced by a tangle of pain, longing, and a gratitude that shamed him. Without a sound, he retreated, returning to the safety of his office. The spreadsheet on his computer suddenly seemed irrelevant. What was his net worth in the face of that small miracle? He didn't reprimand Eleanor, and his silence, to her, was a tacit permission, a crack in the armor. In the days that followed, music became a discreet ritual. Elena felt Mrs. Gable's watchful eye on her, but the house manager couldn't complain about a phone playing softly in the room. Still, the tension between the two women grew. A cold war waged in glances and clipped sentences. Emboldened by Leo's progress and Richard's inaction, Elena felt it was time to take the next step. One evening, when Richard was at a business dinner and Mrs. Gable was busy in the kitchen, she pushed Leo's wheelchair out of his room. "Let's take a walk, Leo," she whispered. They crossed the silent hallway and stopped before the grand living room. The piano, covered by its white sheet, looked like a ghost in the center of the room, imposing and sad. Dust motes danced in the beams of moonlight, filtering through the high windows. "It was your mother's, wasn't it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a murmur. Leo just nodded, his eyes fixed on the shrouded form. Then, slowly, Elena reached out. Her fingers trembled as they neared the fabric, hovering inches from that universe of memories and prohibitions. Elena's fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of the act she was about to commit. That sheet was more than a piece of cloth. It was the materialization of a man's pain, the shroud of a joy that once filled this house. But looking at Leo's face, at the contained expectation in his eyes, she knew the fear of punishment was less than the need to try. With a slow, deliberate motion, she took hold of the corner of the cloth. The fabric was soft and heavy, and as she lifted it, a gust of air smelling of fine wood and the dust of time escaped. Like a long-held breath, only a corner was revealed, a small triangle of gleaming darkness. The piano's black lacquer reflecting the moonlight like a still pool of water. Below, a glimpse of the keys, a row of perfect white teeth, untouched by time. Leo let out a low sound, a gasp of awe and longing. His small hand rose, his fingers stretching toward the keys, a yearning so profound it was almost palpable. "Mummy," he whispered, the word so fragile it was nearly lost in the vastness of the room. In that instant, Elena knew she had done the right thing. This gesture was a thread of light, a connection to a memory that shouldn't be feared, but welcomed. But the light was instantly swallowed by darkness. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. She stood at the entrance to the room, her silhouette rigid against the light from the hallway. Her face was a mask of disbelief that quickly morphed into restrained fury. Elena dropped the sheet as if it burned, the fabric falling back into place with a dull thud that seemed to echo throughout the mansion. "Mrs. Gable, I was just—" "You don't have to explain anything," the house manager interrupted, striding into the room, her shoes making a sharp, irritated sound on the marble floor. "I gave you an order, a direct order from your employer. Do you have any idea of the gravity of what you've done?" She wasn't looking at Eleanor, but at the piano, as if the caregiver had desecrated a sacred altar. "Leo wanted to see it," Elena tried to argue, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It was important to him." "Important?" Mrs. Gable scoffed, the sound harsh. "You don't know what's important in this house. You are an employee. Your job is to follow the rules, not to decide what's best for the boy. This audacity of yours could cost you dearly. It could cost you your job." The threat hung between them, cold and heavy. Leo, who had been watching in silence, began to cry softly, the sound of his sobs filling the tense atmosphere. The house manager finally tore her gaze from the piano and fixed it on the boy, her face softening for an instant before hardening again as she faced Elena. "Take him to his room, now." Defeated, Elena maneuvered the wheelchair out of the room, Leo's crying the soundtrack to her humiliating retreat. She could feel Mrs. Gable's eyes burning into her back, a silent and unforgiving judgment. In his room, as she calmed the boy, Elena felt cornered. Every small attempt to bring life into this house was met with fierce resistance. It was like trying to grow a flower in solid concrete. Meanwhile, in the living room, Mrs. Gable straightened the sheet over the piano, smoothing every fold with obsessive precision. She didn't see Elena as a benefactor, but as a destabilizing element, an anomaly that threatened the order she worked so hard to maintain. Mrs. Gable's loyalty was to Richard, to the broken man who had entrusted her with the administration of his fortress of pain. She believed that protecting him meant protecting the status quo, keeping all the doors locked and all the memories under a sheet. And this caregiver, with her camera and her music, was trying to pick every lock. That night, she decided it was time to act. She waited for the lights in Richard's office to go out and for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. As he passed down the hall, she emerged from her room, her face composed in an expression of grave concern. "Mr. Richard, excuse me, we need to have a very serious talk about the new caregiver." Richard stopped mid-hallway, a dark silhouette against the faint light of a wall sconce. He had just finished a video conference with Tokyo, his mind still spinning with numbers, market projections, and the fluctuating price of gold. Mrs. Gable's approach brought him back to the cold reality of the mansion. The house manager's expression was an omen, the kind of look that preceded trouble. He had known her for years, since before his fortune became an empire, and he knew how to read her signals. "What is it, Mrs. Gable?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weariness of a 12-hour workday. "It's about the young woman, Elena," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, as if sharing a state secret. "She has been overstepping her bounds, disobeying direct orders." Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. He had been expecting a report on some domestic issue, a leaky faucet, a vendor who failed to deliver. He didn't want to deal with staff conflicts. "Be more specific." The house manager then narrated her version of events, painting the incident with the piano not as an act of compassion, but of deliberate insubordination. She described the scene as an invasion, a violation of a sacred space, carefully omitting Leo's reaction, the whispered call for his mother. "She is acting on her own, sir, introducing elements that could disrupt Leo's routine and his emotional equilibrium. I warned her. But she seems not to understand the hierarchy of this house." The word hierarchy was spoken with emphasis. For Mrs. Gable, the order of the universe began right there, in the halls of that mansion, with Richard at the top and her as his faithful enforcer. Elena was just a temporary piece, and she was out of line. Richard listened in silence, his face impassive. Inside, a conflict was brewing. The part of him that was the CEO, the multimillionaire accustomed to having his orders executed without question, felt irritated. Rules were the bedrock of his world, but another part, the father who had seen his son truly smile for the first time in years, felt a pang of doubt. The disruption Mrs. Gable described had brought a result that no amount of his net worth could buy. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Gable," he said finally, his voice neutral. "I will take care of it in the morning. Ensure that Leo is no longer exposed to situations that might agitate him." The answer was ambiguous enough to appease the house manager, but it wasn't the dismissal she had hoped for. Satisfied that she had planted the seed of mistrust, Mrs. Gable bid him good night and retreated. Richard, however, did not go to his room. He walked slowly down the stairs and stopped before the living room. He didn't enter. He just stood there, looking at the ghostly shape of the covered piano, the prohibition he himself had imposed, now seeming less like a protection and more like a prison. The next morning, breakfast was tense. Mrs. Gable served with a quiet efficiency and an air of restrained victory. Elena, feeling the weight of judgment, kept her eyes down, focusing only on helping Leo. Richard came down later than usual, the knot of his tie already perfectly in place. He did not sit. He stood behind Leo's chair, hands in his trouser pockets. "Elena, come to my office after Leo is finished," he said, his formal voice cutting through the silence. There was no anger in his tone, but there was no warmth either. It was the voice he used to close deals, distant and impersonal. Elena felt a cold knot in her stomach. The day of reckoning had arrived. She spent the next few minutes in a daze, helping Leo eat, her mind rehearsing defenses, arguments, but knowing that in the end, her position was fragile. She was just an employee. He was the owner of everything. When she finally entered the office, the morning sun streamed through the glass walls, illuminating an environment of power and control. Richard was standing with his back to her, looking out at the garden. "Close the door," he said without turning. She obeyed, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door closing. He then turned, and his gaze was unreadable, a mixture of hardness and something else, something she couldn't decipher. "Explain yourself." Richard's command, "Explain yourself," hung in the sterile air of the office, as sharp and cold as the lines of the modern architecture that surrounded him. Elena took a deep breath, gathering the courage she had learned to cultivate in life's most difficult moments. She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in a quiet affirmation of her dignity. Her eyes met his, steady and unadorned. "I don't have an explanation that you would accept as logical," she began, her voice surprisingly calm. "It wasn't an act of insubordination, it was an act of listening. I listen to what Leo doesn't say with words." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This house is too quiet, Mr. Richard. Silence is sometimes heavier than noise. The piano, the music, as the pictures in the garden, they are ways of opening a window to let some air in." Leo was suffocating. Richard didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. The rigidity in his shoulders seemed to lessen by a fraction of a millimeter. He had expected an excuse, an attempt to justify herself within the rules he imposed. He had not expected this answer. It was a language he didn't speak, the language of intuition, of feeling. A language his wife had once mastered and that he had banished from his life along with her memory. "My son's well-being is determined by a team of specialists," he countered, his voice returning to its tone of control, as if reading from the balance sheet of one of his companies. "They establish routines, protocols. Your windows can create dangerous drafts. False hope." He repeated Mrs. Gable's phrase, and the words sounded hollow and rehearsed on his own lips. Elena took a step forward, an instinctive move that broke the formal distance between them. "Hope isn't false when it makes a child truly smile for the first time in years," she said, her voice rising with restrained passion. "What's false is believing that a schedule of therapies can replace the feeling of sun on your face or the memory of a song his mother used to play. You're a billionaire. You have access to any treatment in the world, any financial asset. But you can't buy joy back. It has to be rediscovered in small gestures." The impact of her words was visible. Richard took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. The direct mention of his wealth, not as the solution but as a limitation, disarmed him. No one spoke to him that way. No one dared to point out the flaws in his empire of control. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost on the garden outside. The image of Leo smiling returned to his mind, vivid and undeniable. The truth in Elena's words was unsettling because it echoed a doubt he kept locked in the depths of his soul. What if he was doing everything wrong? "The rules stand," he said finally, his voice lower, almost hoarse. "The piano remains covered. No more unauthorized initiatives. Am I clear?" "Crystal," Elena replied. She didn't feel the sting of defeat, but the vibration of a small victory. He hadn't fired her. He had listened to her. It was more than she had expected. That afternoon, while Leo was taking his nap, Elena sought refuge in a forgotten corner of the garden. She needed to process the conversation, the whirlwind of emotions that had left her exhausted. It was then that she saw, in an annex of the garage, a stack of cardboard boxes covered by a dusty tarp. Curiosity compelled her. Carefully, she lifted the tarp, revealing boxes with faded labels. Family photos, mementos, trips, Anna's things. Her heart quickened. Anna, it was his wife's name. Moved by an impulse she couldn't explain, she opened the top box. Inside, nestled among yellowed tissue paper, were leather-bound photo albums. She took the first one, sat on the cold garage floor, and opened it in her lap. The images transported her to another time, a woman with a radiant smile, with the same eyes as Leo, embracing a younger Richard, whose face was not yet a mask of control. Photos of trips, of parties, of mundane, happy moments, and in almost every one, Leo, a small, vibrant boy, running, jumping, full of life. She flipped through the pages with a mixture of fascination and sadness. It was the chronicle of a lost happiness, the living proof of what the silence of that house tried to erase. She came to a specific page and stopped. The photo showed Anna, beautiful, at the wheel of Richard's classic convertible, with little Leo in the passenger seat, the hair of both flying in the wind, both laughing at the camera. It was an image so full of life it hurt to look at. The next morning, she brought one of the albums to Leo's room. "Look what I found," she said with a studied casualness. Together, they began to look through the pages. The boy, hesitant at first, was soon enchanted, pointing at the photos, his face lighting up as he saw his mother. When they reached the photo in the car, Leo's eyes filled with tears. He touched his mother's face in the image with his fingertips, and then he turned to Elena, his gaze pleading, and whispered the deepest, most impossible wish he held in his heart. "I wish I had a picture like that in Dad's car, to look like Mommy is still watching." Leo's request, whispered with the purity of a wish that knows no impossibilities. hung in the air of the room, more real and heavy than any object. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. It was a line she was not supposed to cross, a door locked with the keys of her employer's pain and grief. The garage, with the luxury cars that were part of Richard's vast assets, was a masculine sanctuary, a temple of steel and power. To violate that space, and moreover, the classic car that appeared in so many photos with Anna, was more than breaking a rule. It was heresy. All night, she weighed the decision. On one side of the scale, the imminent risk of losing her job, of being cast out of this world that, despite its coldness, gave her purpose. On the other, the fragile light in Leo's eyes, the chance to rebuild a bridge between the boy and the happy memory of his mother. By morning, her choice was made. Courage, she thought, is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. And that boy's soul was more important. She waited for the perfect moment. Richard left for a series of meetings about expanding his international business, a day to be filled with discussions of cash flow and the profitability of new investments. Mrs. Gable, in turn, had her monthly doctor's appointment, one of the rare occasions she left the estate. The house was theirs. With quiet determination, Elena went to a garden tool shed and found two wide, sturdy wooden planks. It wasn't a perfect ramp, but with effort and care she could make it work. The work was hard. She positioned the planks from the garage threshold to the passenger door of the navy blue convertible, sweat beading on her forehead. Then she returned to Leo's room. "We're going to make a surprise for your mom, up in heaven," she said, her voice full of a confidence she barely felt. Carefully, she dressed him in a white linen shirt she had found in the memory box, a piece that had clearly belonged to Anna, a little big on him, but which carried immense symbolism. The journey to the garage was slow and tense. As they entered the cool, leather-scented space, Leo's eyes widened. With a strength that surprised Elena, he helped her maneuver the chair over the makeshift ramp. The moment she transferred him to the car seat was one of supreme delicacy and effort. And then he was there, sitting on the leather seat, his small hands on his lap, his body framed by the car window. The afternoon light, golden and soft, streamed through the high garage windows, enveloping him in an almost magical aura. He no longer looked like a boy confined to a chair. He looked free. "Now the smile," Elena requested, raising her camera. "The smile you'd give her if she were driving." And his smile was reborn, open, radiant, a beacon of pure happiness that seemed to light up every dark corner of that garage and that house. She focused the lens, her heart beating erratically. The click of the camera sounded, immortalizing the instant. At that exact moment, the sound of the iron gate opening echoed, a cancelled meeting, an unexpected return. Richard's sedan entered the courtyard, and seeing the garage door open, he frowned and stopped the car. He walked to the entrance, irritation already forming on his face, ready to reprimand the security lapse, and then he stopped, froze. What he saw paralyzed him, stealing the air from his lungs. His son in Anna's car, wearing her shirt and smiling, her smile, and that woman with the camera still raised, capturing the ghost of the happiness he thought he had lost forever. Everything around Richard seemed to dissolve. The numbers, the profits, the compound interest of his financial empire turned to dust. A violent crack split the wall of ice he had built around his heart, and through it an unbearable pain and beauty flooded in, and everything, absolutely everything, changed. The click of the camera was the last note of a world that was coming apart. The silence that followed was dense, charged with electricity, a vacuum where three lives collided. Elena lowered the camera slowly, the cool plastic in her trembling hands. Leo's smile faltered, the joy evaporating as he saw his father's frozen figure at the garage entrance. Richard's face was a blank canvas where a war of emotions was being fought in silence. The initial anger, The violation of his most sacred space was there, but beneath it, something deeper stirred. The shock of recognition, the pain of memory, the vision of a miracle he hadn't dared to ask for. His eyes weren't on Elena, but fixed on Leo. He saw his son, but he also saw the ghost of Anna, the echo of a laugh that haunted him in his loneliest moments. Elena braced for the shouting, for the order of dismissal, for the explosion of fury she felt she deserved. She had desecrated the tomb of his memories. Instead, Richard moved. His steps were slow, hesitant, as if walking on thin glass. He didn't look at her as he passed, his focus entirely on the boy in the car. When he reached the passenger door, he extended a hand, not in anger, but with a trembling reverence, and touched his son's shoulder. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but for Leo, it was like an anchor in a storm. "Daddy!" The boy's voice was a thread. Richard didn't answer. He just swallowed hard, the Adam's apple in his throat bobbing. He then raised his eyes and finally looked at Elena, and in the depths of that stormy grey, she saw something she never expected to see, the unmistakable glint of unshed tears. He didn't say, "Thank you," he didn't have to. The gratitude was there, naked and vulnerable, in a look that said more than 1,000 words. In that instant, the power dynamic between them inverted. He was no longer the billionaire employer, and she, the humble caregiver. They were just a man and a woman, witnesses to a moment of pure, painful beauty, united by the same child. The arrival of Mrs. Gable minutes later broke the spell. The house manager stopped at the garage door, a folder of lab results in her hand, her jaw dropping as she processed the scene. Her reaction was a mixture of horror and indignation. "Mr. Richard, what has she done?" But the reprimand she expected from her employer never came. "It's all right, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice hoarse, without taking his eyes off his son. "Help me get him inside." The order disoriented the house manager. Elena and Richard, together with Mrs. Gable's reluctant assistance, lifted Leo from the car and placed him back in his wheelchair. Throughout the process, Richard's hand never left Leo's shoulder. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of the house transformed. The ice didn't melt completely, but fissures appeared. Richard began to have breakfast with his son, no longer at the distant head of the long dining table, but beside him. He didn't say much, but his presence was a seismic shift. He watched Elena from a distance with a curiosity that intrigued and frightened him. There was a lightness about her, a resilience that he, with all his capital and power, did not possess. She didn't seem to want anything from him, not his money, not his approval. Her sole motivation seemed to be Leo's happiness, and that, for a man accustomed to transactions and vested interests, was disconcerting. One afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, laughing with Leo as they tried, with little success, to bake a chocolate cake. Flour dusted the boy's face, and the sound of his laughter was something Richard was beginning to crave. He stood in the doorway, watching. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of envy, not for other men's fortunes, not for their successful ventures. He envied this woman's courage, the courage to get her hands dirty, to laugh in the midst of pain, to find beauty in small disasters. Eleanor saw him and stopped laughing, the awareness of his presence bringing back the formality. "Mr. Richard, we were just—" "Continue," he said, with a softness that surprised her. He approached, took a dab of flour on his finger, and wiped Leo's cheek. The boy looked up at his father, his eyes shining. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet, was the picture of the miracle in the garage. Someone, likely Elena, had put it there. Richard walked past it every day, and each time he felt the wall inside him tremble, the stones loosening one by one. But old habits and deep defenses do not die easily, and change, he feared, would come with a new kind of pain. The new harmony in the mansion was as delicate as a spider's web, beautiful to behold, but liable to break at the slightest touch. And the crosswind was not long in coming, personified in the austere figure of Mrs. Gable. The house manager observed the growing closeness between Eleanor and Richard with a disapproval that became more palpable each day. In her mind, the natural order of things was being subverted. The caregiver was no longer just an employee. She had become an emotional center of gravity in the house, and that, to Mrs. Gable, was dangerous. She saw Elena's influence not as a cure, but as a seduction, a subtle maneuver to take advantage of the vulnerability of a rich, wounded man. The loyalty Mrs. Gable felt for Richard was possessive, forged in years of silent service and the belief that she, better than anyone, knew what he needed: order, distance, and protection from the unpredictability of the heart. She decided it was her responsibility to intervene, to restore the hierarchy. She chose her moment with the precision of a strategist. One evening, as Richard reviewed financial reports in his office, she knocked on the door, carrying a tray with coffee. "Sir, may I have a word?" she said, her tone heavy with calculated concern. "It's about the well-being of the house." Richard gestured for her to proceed, his eyes still on the computer screen where stock performance charts fluctuated. "I have noticed," Mrs. Gable began, her voice low, "a certain informality that has taken hold. The new caregiver is dedicated, I don't deny it, but perhaps she is confusing her duties. An improper closeness with you and with Leo could create expectations that are not, let us say, professional." The words were like needles, subtle but poisoned. "Improper closeness," Richard repeated, finally looking up from the monitor. The insinuation bothered him, partly because it touched a nerve he himself didn't want to admit existed. "She's just doing her job. Leo has never been better." "Precisely, sir," Mrs. Gable countered smoothly. "Leo's progress is what's most important, and for that very reason, any emotional distraction must be avoided. You are the employer. She is the employee. It is essential for everyone's equilibrium that this line does not become blurred." Mrs. Gable's argument was shrewd. She didn't attack Elena directly, but appealed to Richard's most dominant trait, his need for control and order. She reminded him of his role, his position, evoking the specter of responsibility, the weight of his status, and Richard, torn between the cold logic that had guided him his entire life and the new feelings that were destabilizing him, gave in. The fear of being hurt again, of opening a door to chaos, was stronger. The next day, he called Eleanor to his office. This time, he was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, the physical barrier re-establishing the distance between them. "Elena," he began, avoiding her gaze, "from now on, your interactions with me and with Leo are to be strictly limited to your duties. Mrs. Gable will supervise the routine closely. Meals and leisure activities will be conducted by her when necessary. Your focus is to be on basic care only." Each word was a blow. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't a dismissal, it was something worse, a demotion, an annulment. He was putting her back in a box, locking the door that he himself, with his tear-filled eyes in the garage, had helped to open. Hurt, but with her dignity intact, she merely nodded. "As you wish." The change was immediate and brutal. The house grew cold again. The silent breakfasts returned. Mrs. Gable was ever present, a watchful shadow, interrupting any conversation that deviated from the strictly necessary. Leo, sensing the new invisible barrier, regressed. The light in his eyes faded, and he retreated back into his world of silence. Days later, a fine, persistent rain was falling over Westchester. Elena, feeling suffocated inside the mansion, sought refuge under the porch overhang in the garden. She was holding one of the photos she had taken of Leo, the one of his smile in the garden. A few raindrops, carried by the wind, had stained the image, blurring the boy's happy face. She tried to wipe the smudge away with her fingertip, uselessly. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent and bitter. She wept not for her employer's order, but for the light that was fading in Leo's eyes. And that is how Richard found her. He was in the living room, watching the rain, when he saw her. He hesitated for a moment, the order he himself had given echoing in his mind, but the sight of her, huddled and vulnerable, shattered his resolve. He walked out onto the porch without an umbrella, feeling the cool mist on his face. He stopped beside her. She didn't look at him, trying to hide her tear-streaked face. He saw the blurred photograph in her hands. Without thinking, moved only by an impulse that came from a place deeper than logic, he reached out and touched her arm. A brief, hesitant touch, his skin warm against hers, but it was enough. In that contact, an electric current of understanding, of regret, and of an undeniable attraction passed between them, igniting something that neither of them, at that moment, dared to name. Richard's touch lasted only a second, but it reverberated like a piano note in an empty room. He pulled his hand back almost instantly, as if he had touched fire, an alarm blaring in his mind programmed for control. Elena flinched too, not from repulsion, but from the shock of that unexpected electricity. The awkwardness that settled between them was thicker than the rainy mist. Neither knew what to say. The rules he himself had imposed had been broken by his own gesture. The picture, it's ruined, Elena said, her voice choked, just to fill the silence with something trivial. I can print another one, he replied, his voice equally tense. I have professional equipment in my office. The offer was more than a simple solution for a smudged photo. It was an apology, a clumsy attempt to repair the damage his orders had caused. It was an olive branch. In the following days, the touch on the porch remained an unspoken secret between them. The rigid rules imposed by Richard began to be subtly sabotaged by himself. He would show up at Leo's physical therapy room under the pretext of checking on his progress. He would ask Elena questions about the boy's day, seeking openings for a conversation that went beyond the functional. Mrs. Gable watched it all with hawk eyes, her frustration growing with each of her employer's minor infractions. She saw the fortress she had sworn to protect being undermined from within. Richard's curiosity about Elena grew daily. The woman intrigued him. She lived in his house, cared for his most precious possession, yet he knew nothing about her life before she crossed his iron gate. One night, using his skills and resources, he did what he did best. He researched. In a few minutes, using only her full name, his vast digital power revealed the story she had never told. He found the records of a full merit scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious photography schools. He saw the date she had put her studies on hold, coinciding with her mother's terminal diagnosis. He read about the medical debts, about the modest apartment she had lost. The narrative that unfolded on his screen was not one of failure, but of a quiet, profound sacrifice. The abandonment of a dream to care for a loved one. The revelation hit him hard. He, who used his immense net worth to move markets and build skyscrapers, felt humbled by this woman's wealth of character. Her strength was not in financial assets, but in an integrity that money could not buy. Compelled by a mixture of admiration and guilt, he decided to act in the only way he knew how, with money. The next day, he called her to his office again. This time, there was no desk between them. There was an envelope on the coffee table. I know about your scholarship, he said, direct. I know why you had to stop. I want to help. This envelope contains enough to clear your debts and pay for your entire degree. Consider it a bonus, an investment in your talent. He expected gratitude, perhaps tears of relief, but Elena's reaction was one he could never have predicted. She looked at the envelope, then at him, and a glint of disappointment and wounded pride flashed in her eyes. I appreciate your generosity, Mr. Richard, she said. her voice firm and clear. "But I can't accept this." Richard was stunned. "Why not? This would solve your problems. It would free you to follow your dream." "My dream is not for sale," she replied, "and my problems are mine to solve. I don't want a shortcut. I want to earn my way. When I go back to school, it will be with my own effort, from my own work, not as an act of charity from my boss." The refusal was a blow to his ego, but also a blow to his heart. For the first time, someone challenged him without fear, refusing the power of his money. She didn't see him as a savior, but as a man trying to turn everything into a financial transaction, including her dreams. Her refusal disarmed him completely, but it also forced him to see her in a new light. She wasn't a victim to be rescued. She was a force of nature, with a dignity his fortune couldn't even scratch. The tension between them, once made of rules and prohibitions, now morphed into something more complex, a reluctant respect, a growing admiration, and an attraction that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But fate, which seemed to be testing the limits of their emotions, was preparing an even harsher blow, coming from a front that Richard, in his arrogance, had underestimated. The phone rang. On the other end of the line, a cool, elegant voice he hadn't heard in months, but which still had the power to chill his blood. His ex-mother-in-law. The voice of Esther, his ex-mother-in-law, came through the phone with the sharp clarity of breaking crystal. She was a woman forged in steel and etiquette, whose family fortune was old, inherited, and who viewed Richard's wealth, built with the aggressive agility of the stock and crypto markets, as something new and slightly vulgar. The call was not a courtesy. Esther went straight to the point, with a surgeon's precision. "Richard, I've been in touch with Dr. Heinze in Switzerland," she said, the doctor's name sounding like a luxury brand. "His clinic has an opening for Leo. The treatment is state-of-the-art, focused on intensive neurological rehabilitation. It's time we stop with this palliative care at home and be rational." The word rational was Esther's weapon of choice. It was with that word that, after Anna's death, she had convinced him to shut himself off from the world, to turn grief into a spreadsheet of control, to believe that pain was an inefficient emotion that should be eliminated. "Leo is fine, Esther," Richard replied, the defensiveness in his voice surprising him. "He's making progress." "Progress?" she scoffed subtly. "Don't mistake an improved mood for a clinical recovery. He needs specialists. Richard, not a caregiver with good intentions. You owe him the best that science can offer, not an environment of sentimentalism." The pressure was immense. Esther wasn't just Leo's grandmother. She was an influential figure with a network of contacts that could open or close doors with a single phone call. Deep down, Richard knew there was a grain of truth in her words, the cold, logical truth that had always guided him. Was he sacrificing his son's future for the emotional comfort Elena had brought? The dilemma consumed him. Esther's visit a week later was like the arrival of an early winter. She swept through the mansion with a critical eye, noting the photo on the refrigerator with a disapproving sniff. When she was introduced to Eleanor, her greeting was glacial, a nod of the head that barely acknowledged her as a human being. The confrontation happened in the garden. Elena was with Leo, showing him how the camera lens could focus on a single dewdrop on a rose petal. Esther approached, her heels sinking slightly into the manicured lawn. "Miss," she said, completely ignoring the boy, "I believe your work here, however well-intentioned, has come to an end. My grandson requires serious medical care, not distractions." Elena stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "With all due respect, Mum, what I do is not a distraction. It's part of the healing. Leo needs science, but he needs joy too." Elena's response, calm and respectful but unwavering, infuriated Esther. "You are overstepping your bounds in a dangerous way," the matriarch said, her voice lowering to a threatening hiss. "You are nothing but an employee, and you are interfering in family decisions that are none of your concern." Richard arrived at that exact moment, drawn by the voices. The scene he found was one of paralyzing tension. His ex-mother-in-law, the personification of his past of guilt and control, and Elena, the symbol of an uncertain, emotional future, at an impasse over his son's destiny. "Esther, please," he began. "Richard, be a man for once in your life and make the right decision." She cut him off, turning to him. "Are you going to let my daughter's memory be tarnished by this affair? Will you allow your son's future to be compromised by a fantasy? The clinic is waiting. It's what's best for him, and you know it." The pressure, coming from all sides, broke him. The old guilt, the voice of cold reason, the fear of being selfish. He looked at Elena, his face a mask of agony. He saw the strength in her, but in that moment, he did not have that same strength within himself. He caved. Again. "She's right," he said, the words coming out like shards of glass. He couldn't look at Eleanor. "Pack your things. The accountant will settle everything with you." The sentence was a death knell for the atmosphere that had been created. Eleanor didn't cry, didn't beg. She just looked at him with a deep, quiet disappointment that was 1,000 times worse than any accusation. She nodded, gave one last look at Leo, who was already beginning to cry as he sensed the impending catastrophe, and turned to go inside the house. Hours later, when she came downstairs with her small suitcase, Leo was in the living room. Seeing her ready to leave, he did something he had never done before. With a cry of anguish, he tore the photos from the collage they had built together on the wall. The picture of him smiling in the garden, the photo in the garage, all were ripped to pieces. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the silent mansion like a final goodbye, a heart breaking in two. Elena closed her eyes for an instant, the sharp pain hitting her. Then she turned and walked to the door without looking back. Elena's departure left a vacuum in the mansion, an absence so palpable it seemed to have shape and weight. The silence that returned was not the same as before, peaceful and controlled. It was a sick, heavy silence, the silence of a battlefield after the surrender. Richard tried to convince himself he had made the right decision, the rational one, as Esther had insisted. He threw himself into work with renewed ferocity, chain-smoking through meetings, analyzing the bond market and investment funds, turning pain into numbers and guilt into transactions. But the profits accumulating in his dollar and euro accounts could not fill the void in his chest. The house had become a mausoleum again. Mrs. Gable restored her impeccable order, but the rigidity now seemed fragile, a thin layer of ice over deep, turbulent waters. Leo was the epicenter of the pain. He refused to leave his room, to eat, to speak to his physical therapists. The smile Elena had rediscovered was buried under a layer of apathy and sadness that was deeper than before. He spent hours looking at the torn pieces of photos he had saved in a box, the fragments of a happiness that had been stolen from him. Richard couldn't face his son. Every glance at the boy was a mirror reflecting his own cowardice. The decision that was supposed to have been an act of fatherly responsibility now revealed itself for what it truly was, an act of fear. Fear of feeling, fear of connecting, fear of losing control. 3 days after Elena left, Richard entered Leo's room late at night. The boy was asleep, his face stained with dried tears. The father sat on the edge of the bed, a dark figure in the silent room. His eyes wandered around the room and stopped on something on the floor, partially hidden under the dresser. He bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph, one he had never seen. It was a portrait of Leo, taken in the garage on the day of the miracle. But in this photo, the boy wasn't smiling at the camera. He was looking to the side, out of frame, with an expression of pure adoration. And on his face, reflected in the gleam of the car's polished body, was the silhouette of Elena kneeling, camera to her face. It was a photo about a gaze, about connection. Richard turned the picture over, his heart hammering against his ribs. On the back, in a neat, firm hand, was writing in black ink, a single sentence: "Life also needs courage." Those 4 words hit him with the force of a revelation. It wasn't an accusation, it was a truth. A truth that Elena lived and that he had rejected. Courage wasn't in building a financial empire, in mastering the stock market, or in accumulating an incalculable net worth. Courage was in kneeling on a cold floor to make a child smile. It was in refusing easy money to earn one's own way. It was in facing pain head-on instead of hiding behind walls of silence. The sentence haunted him. It echoed in his mind during the sleepless night, superimposed itself over the numbers on his computer screens, whispered to him in the empty hallways. Life also needs courage. The next morning, Richard woke up a different man. The crack in his armor, which had started with a smile in the garden, had finally shattered it completely. He saw with blinding clarity the prison he had built for himself and his son. He saw that Esther was not an advisor, but the architect of his cell. He saw that Mrs. Gable was not a protector, but the warden of that prison. And he saw that Eleanor was not an employee, but the personification of the freedom he so feared and now desperately craved. He picked up the phone. The first call was to Switzerland. He cancelled the reservation at the clinic, his voice firm and unwavering. The second was to his ex-mother-in-law. "Esther," he said when she answered, "I appreciate your concern, but I am taking control of my son's life from now on. Your decisions are no longer welcome here." He hung up before she could respond. The third action was not a call, it was a face-to-face conversation with Mrs. Gable. He was brief and, for the first time, honest. "Mrs. Gable, your loyalty has been misplaced. This house needs life, not order. Your time here is over." He offered her a generous severance package, a final act of a man who used to solve everything with money, but the decision was irrevocable. The fortress was being dismantled, stone by stone, and then there was only one thing left to do: find her. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to try. He took the photo, the sentence facing up, and left the house, not as the billionaire in his luxury sedan, but as a man in search of redemption, in search of the courage he lacked. Richard's search was not an operation of his vast business machine. He didn't deploy lawyers or private investigators. For the first time, he acted not as a multi-millionaire moving pieces on a board, but as a man following the only lead that mattered, her heart. He remembered what he had discovered about her abandoned scholarship, the sacrifice for her mother. A person like that wouldn't just vanish. She would return to her roots, to the place where her strength was forged. He began visiting community centers and social projects in the working-class boroughs of New York City, places where his luxury sedan looked like a spaceship that had landed on another planet. For 2 days, he found nothing, but on the third day, on a bustling street in the Bronx, he heard it. The laughter of children mixed with the sound of amateur camera clicks. He followed the sound to a modest warehouse, its walls painted with colorful graffiti, and there she was. Elena was in the center of a circle of children, teaching them how to frame the world through simple plastic lenses. She was radiant, more alive and beautiful than he had ever seen her within the cold walls of his mansion. She wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, yet she seemed richer than anyone he had ever met in his meetings about inheritances and investment funds. He stood in the doorway, watching, unnoticed. He saw the patience with which she knelt to adjust a little girl's hand on a camera, the genuine smile she offered a boy who had captured a blurry image of a butterfly. In that moment, he understood. He hadn't fired her from a job, he had freed her from a prison, and in doing so, he realized just how imprisoned he himself was. Here, in this noisy, vibrant warehouse, was true wealth, true profit, the return on the soul that none of his stocks could ever provide. When the children left, leaving a trail of happy energy, he walked in. She was packing up the equipment when she sensed his presence. She turned and saw him, and her body went rigid. The shock in her eyes was quickly replaced by a protective neutrality. "Mr. Richard, what are you doing here?" He walked toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. He did not carry the arrogance of power, but the humility of a broken man. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice clear and direct. "A terrible mistake. I wasn't being rational. I was being a coward. I let fear make my decisions, and I hurt you, and I destroyed my son in the process." Elena listened in silence, her heart pounding. "Leo hasn't spoken since you left," he continued, his voice cracking for the first time. "He tore up the pictures. He's gone dark, and it's my fault. I didn't come here to offer you your job back. I don't have the right. I came here to ask for your forgiveness and to ask for your help. Not for me, for him." He held out his hand and showed her the photo he had found, the one of her reflection in the car. "I read what you wrote. It took me 3 days to understand what it meant. Now I know." His vulnerability was genuine, overwhelming. She saw the truth of his transformation in his eyes. This was not the same man who had reprimanded her in the office. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that his healing, and maybe mine, isn't in a clinic in Switzerland. It's in relearning how to see life, and no one can teach him that better than you." Then, an idea, born from that revelation, took shape. "Let's have a show," he said, energy returning to his voice. "A photography exhibition, here at this community center, with your students' photos, and yours and his. We'll call it Eyes That See Again. We'll show the world that beauty can be found anywhere, that the light always comes back." Elena looked at him, at the warehouse around them, at the camera in her hands. This was her dream, not the one he had offered with money, but one born of a real purpose, of a human connection. It was a chance to rewrite their destiny, not as employer and employee, but as partners. "I'll help," she said, "for Leo." But as she said it, they both knew it was for so much more. It was for the beginning of something new, built not on the base of a net worth, but on the foundation of courage and light. The following weeks were a whirlwind of transformative activity. Richard, the man who commanded an empire from a silent office, now spent his days in a vibrant warehouse in the Bronx. He traded his suits for jeans, his spreadsheets for hammers and paintbrushes, using his own resources. But following Elena's vision, he helped transform the space. It wasn't a luxury renovation, but a revitalization that kept the soul of the place. New lighting, panels for the photos, a small sound system. He wasn't the boss. He was a helper. He carried boxes, listened to opinions, learned names, and most importantly, he was present. Elena, in turn, flourished. With Richard's support, she could devote herself fully to the project. She and Leo spent entire afternoons together, no longer in the mansion, but at the community center or in public parks. She gave him a new camera, more modern, but just as simple. And slowly, with the patience of an artisan, she helped him rebuild his vision. Leo's first click was hesitant, but the second was firmer. He began photographing small things, an ant carrying a leaf, the reflection of a cloud in a puddle, the smile of one of the other children. Each photo was a step out of his cocoon of silence. The opening night of the Eyes That See Again exhibition arrived, bringing a mix of anxiety and hope. The warehouse was packed. Neighborhood residents, the children's parents, a few of Elena's friends, and to the surprise of many, figures from Richard's corporate world who had come out of curiosity and ended up genuinely touched. The walls were covered with life. The children's photos were pure and instinctive. Elena's were visual poems, full of light and shadow, capturing the resilient beauty of the everyday. And Leo's were on a special panel. They were delicate images, showing a world seen from a different height, a world where details mattered more than the whole. Richard and Elena greeted people side by side, not as employer and ex-employee, but as curators, as partners. At one point, amidst the crowd, Leo, in his motorized wheelchair, maneuvered until he stopped in front of his father. He was holding something in his hands, one last photo, mounted in a simple frame. He held it out to Richard. The image was a portrait of Richard himself, taken a few days earlier in the warehouse. He was laughing, an open and unguarded laugh, as one of the children painted his face with finger paint. It was a man Richard barely recognized. A man free from the armor of his wealth. At the bottom of the frame, a small caption written in Leo's hesitant handwriting. "Daddy, she taught me how to live again. Now you teach her how to stay." The sound of conversation in the warehouse seemed to vanish. Richard's world shrank to that photo, to those words. A knot formed in his throat, and the tears he had held back for so long finally came, without shame, in front of everyone. He knelt before his son's wheelchair and hugged him, a hug that contained years of apology and a universe of rediscovered love. "I will," he whispered in Leo's ear. "I promise." When he stood up, his eyes searched for Elena's across the room. She was standing near her panel of photos, watching the scene, her own eyes shining. The silence that passed between them was absolute, a perfect communication that needed no words. In front of everyone, without rushing, Richard walked to her. He didn't say anything, he just held out his hand. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and she saw there not a request, but a promise, a future, and she took it. The simple, discreet joining of their hands sealed the fate of 3 lives. The last image of that night was not captured by any camera, but was etched into the memory of both. Later, in the mansion's garage, now a place not of pain, but of rebirth. The setting sun gilded the hood of the classic convertible. Leo was between them, laughing, as Richard and Elena, holding hands, looked at the sky. Her camera lay on the ground, forgotten for a moment. A new portrait was being born, one that needed no lens to be seen. It was a story of light that became courage, and that, finally, had become love.